Sandra, a 75-year-old retired teacher, arrived at court in an orange jumpsuit. She was handcuffed to a chain at her waist. She smiled at her relatives, including her husband Fred, who was 87 years old. Today marked the day the jury would decide whether or not Sandra should spend the rest of her days in prison. She sat down and looked at the man on the screen, who was her grandson, who she shot and killed a few months earlier. Jonathan Hoffman, a talented and compassionate young man from West Bloomfield, Michigan, was better known for his humor and personality than his wardrobe. A senior at Farmington Central High School, Jonathan excelled in computer repair, even constructing a custom computer from scratch. Awarded with a full-ride scholarship to Eastern Michigan University, he aimed to graduate alongside his classmates in June 2011. This remarkable achievement reflected Jonathan's perseverance in overcoming the academic challenges that led him to transfer from North Farmington High School. Jonathan's parents divorced over 6 years ago, but they remained close, living just a block apart. Every year, they would take a family vacation to Arizona and eventually decided to move there permanently in 2011. However, soon after their arrival, his 14-year-old sister Jessica was diagnosed with a non-malignant brain tumor. She faced a long hospital stay, multiple surgeries, and extensive rehabilitation. As Jessica became the focus of their parents' attention during her recovery, Jonathan struggled to adapt to his new school, missing his old friends and familiar surroundings. Aware that they couldn't meet his needs entirely at that moment, his parents accepted the offer from his grandmother, Sandra Layne. She invited Jonathan to live with her and complete his senior year at his old school, allowing him time and space to better adjust. Sandra, a sweet woman, worked as a teacher in California before moving to West Bloomfield 30 years ago. Married to Fred Layne for 28 years, she adored her 5 children and 9 grandchildren, especially Jonathan. Despite being considered meddlesome by Jonathan's father, she remained a loving presence in their lives, always ready to prepare little bubbly potatoes and brisket during his visits. Jonathan's father also didn't like the thought of separating the family, but Jonathan reassured them. "I'll be fine," he said. "Don't worry about me. I'm with Grandma." In the fall of 2011, Jonathan returned to Michigan to live with his beloved grandmother, Sandra, and her caring husband, Fred. They resided in the tranquil Maple Place Villas condo complex in West Bloomfield, a picturesque town that instilled feelings of peace. His devoted mother, Jennifer, prioritized visiting every month. She would take a 10-day break from her busy career to tend to her ailing sister and spend quality time with her cherished son. During the periods when she couldn't be physically present, Jennifer made sure to call Jonathan daily to ensure his well-being. On the surface, everything appeared ideal. However, unbeknownst to Jennifer, Jonathan harbored a distressing secret. The revelation of Jonathan's hidden truth came in January 2012. He had started experimenting with drugs, engaging in a dangerous game that led him down a dark path. One ill-fated night, while under the influence of hallucinogenic mushrooms, Jonathan became convinced that his life was slipping away. Terror overwhelmed him, and in a desperate attempt for help, he contacted the authorities. The police escorted him to the hospital for urgent care. At her home in Arizona, Jennifer received a heart-stopping phone call that altered her reality forever. Driven by love and concern for her son's safety, she boarded the first flight to Michigan without hesitation. In a state of shock and distress, Jennifer faced the bitter truth of her son's drug use. Desperate to help him, she considered sending him to rehab, but Sandra, the caring grandmother, urged her to address Jonathan's issues within the family. Tragically, Jonathan's father could not make it to Michigan because of Jessica's health condition. Jennifer's sister, Jessica, had recently undergone surgery to remove a tumor and required rigorous physical and occupational therapy several times a week for recovery. In turn, Michael, Jonathan's father, had to stay behind and care for Jessica while finding comfort in knowing that Jennifer and Jonathan were under Sandra's watchful eye. Jonathan had promised not to repeat his drug experiment and expressed remorse for his actions, but he was charged with marijuana possession in March. Unfortunately, things took a turn for the worse on May 18th when gunshots were reported at a condo community. Sandra, Jonathan's grandmother, was discovered by officers in a distressed and bloody state, confessing to murdering him. Upon entering the residence, authorities found Jonathan's lifeless body with several gunshot wounds. Sandra, who was 74 years old, was subsequently taken into custody. An autopsy revealed both the severity of Jonathan's injuries and traces of synthetic marijuana in his bloodstream. Jonathan's funeral was a solemn occasion where friends and family shared touching memories of the loving brother he was. His sister, Jessica, spoke movingly about her brother, and everyone who knew him was left reeling from the shock of losing someone so young. It was an utterly tragic event that left Jennifer and all who knew Jonathan mourning the loss of a precious life taken far too soon. The aftermath of this tragedy left many in a state of confusion and struggling to comprehend how a grandmother could commit such a horrendous act against her own grandson. Even the police were at a loss for words, and when questioned about her motives, Sandra simply stated that she was afraid without providing further explanation. Sandra was formally arraigned on May 21, 2012, and she pleaded not guilty to the charge of open murder. The jury, comprised of 7 women and 5 men, faced the difficult task of determining her fate. They deliberated on whether the act was premeditated murder, involuntary manslaughter, or self-defense. Throughout the trial, Sandra received support from a small group of family and friends who attempted to lift her spirits with smiles and waves in the courtroom. As the trial progressed, Sandra took the stand to testify in her own defense. She claimed that she had become fearful of Jonathan's dangerous friends, who she believed might try to steal her valuables. Feeling desperate and uncertain about how to handle the situation, Sandra made the decision to purchase a gun for $700 in April 2012. She kept this decision a secret from her husband and other family members and spent weeks secretly practicing shooting at a range. The day of the tragic event arrived when Sandra drove Jonathan to a drug testing site where he tested positive for spice, a synthetic form of marijuana, and was facing potential jail time for violating probation. An intense argument ensued between grandmother and grandson, continuing when they returned home. Jonathan demanded $2,000 and threatened to take Sandra's car, intending to flee Michigan after failing the drug test. Overwhelmed and longing for Jonathan's attention, Sandra desperately wanted him to listen to her. Amidst the heated exchange, Sandra reached her breaking point and retrieved the gun she had purchased. In a moment of chaos, she claimed that Jonathan kicked her in the chest, leading her to shoot him in self-defense. Strangely, she did not immediately realize the severity of his injuries and even asked him if he wanted a cup of water. During the trial, Sandra's credibility as a witness was heavily criticized by the prosecution due to several loopholes. These included the fact that she had never reported the alleged attack to the police and that a hospital examination showed no signs of injuries, making her version of events inconsistent and lacking believability. Sandra's husband, Fred Layne, also gave testimony during the trial, revealing that Sandra had asked him to take their dog for a walk right after they returned from Jonathan's drug test. When Fred returned, he sensed something was wrong and rushed to Botsford Hospital, where he received the distressing news that Jonathan had passed away. Investigation showed that Fred had no prior knowledge of Sandra owning a gun. He recalled past arguments about Jonathan's drug use, but claimed he had never witnessed any physical violence between Sandra and their grandson. Throughout the trial, it became clear that Jonathan's drug use was a significant source of contention between him and Sandra. Fred admitted that he had repeatedly urged Sandra to send Jonathan back to his parents in Arizona, as he found the situation overwhelming. The prosecution, however, questioned Fred's inconsistent responses, which they attributed to his age. The evidence presented during the trial indicated that Sandra shot Jonathan downstairs, causing him to flee upstairs, leaving a trail of blood. Sandra followed and shot him again in the bathroom, leading him to make the distressing 911 call before succumbing to his injuries. The defense portrayed Sandra as a caring grandmother who had grown increasingly fearful of her grandson's behavior and drug associations, leading her to purchase the gun for self-defense. The prosecution, however, depicted Sandra as controlling and unable to manage Jonathan's problems and hostility. The repeated shooting, even after he was wounded, raised doubts about her claims of self-defense. After 2 days of deliberations, the jury listened to Sandra's testimony and the 911 call before handing down a guilty verdict for second-degree murder, signifying an intent to harm but not premeditated murder. During sentencing, Sandra's lawyer requested a minimum of 12 years, highlighting her remorse. Sandra herself pleaded for just 3 years, expressing her deep sorrow and apologizing for her actions. However, the presiding judge sentenced her to 22 to 40 years in prison, along with a mandatory 2-year sentence for using a gun. The trial raised awareness of the complexities of family dynamics and the devastating impact of drug use on relationships. Regardless of the verdict, both sides suffered pain and loss, leaving everyone questioning if there was anything that could have been done differently to prevent the tragic outcome. The recording of the 911 call served as a poignant reminder of the consequences of unchecked emotions and actions, bringing closure to Michael Hoffman, who could hold on to the memory of his son as a loving and wonderful individual.